Okay, we're going to turn from Averroes to Hugh of St. Victor. For those of you who don't know Hugh of St. Victor was the leader of the Abbey School of St. Victor on the outskirts of Paris in the 12th century. This abbey was right beyond the city walls, and Hugh moves there at a really fascinating time in the tradition of the liberal arts classical tradition. It's right between the rise of the cathedral schools and the rise of the medieval universities. So this is before the University of Paris is founded, which happens 50 years after Hugh, but it's right at the apex, or right after the apex of the cathedral schools. So that's who we're going to spend a little time with here. But before I go on with Hugh, I want to ask you a question. When you're asked, because I'm sure you are, what is classical education, how do you answer? Just think about that for a second. How do you answer the question when your parents, potential students, friends, what is classical education? I was asked this twice last night within 10 minutes over the same glass of wine from people who were here at the conference but new to classical education. So it's a question I often face. It's a question we faced. Several of us spoke at a classical education conference in Nairobi, Kenya back in November, and it's one of the leading questions there. What is this kind of education? Where does it come from? So last summer, I compiled a list of 20 definitions from leading schools and institutions in the States and spent an hour with my graduate students analyzing these definitions. I won't tell you where they come from, but if you scan through, here are just 5 of the better ones. There are some things that stand out, some commonalities. In particular, if you look down through that list, I'm sure you'll see the liberal arts, either the arts or the idea of the liberal arts being referred to in all of these definitions as somehow integral to what we're doing. But it strikes me that there's some confusion potentially still remains, because the question sometimes is, how are the liberal arts, which we talk a lot about, how are they integrated with the rest of education, or the rest of what we know happens in our schools, which are not simply about the liberal arts? This is especially true for people who are new to classical education, and it's the question of whether these represent the sum of classical education, the trivium and the quadrivium, how they relate again to everything else that gets taught, questions of whether every subject with respect to the trivium has its own grammar, logic, and rhetoric, as Susan Wise-Bauer seemed to indicate last night, whether, for instance, the trivium follows Dorothy Sayers' rather idiosyncratic interpretation and decidedly non-classical interpretation of them, that they represent somehow stages of a child's development, which is something she invented. And how they relate to the various divisions of knowledge and science that we also inherit with the liberal arts in the tradition. So that they're central, though, is common to the tradition. Here's Hugh in his great work, the Didascalicon. He says, out of all the sciences above named, the ancients in their studies especially selected 7 to be mastered by those who were to be educated. These 7 they considered so to excel all the rest in usefulness that anyone who had been thoroughly schooled in them might afterward come to a knowledge of the others by his own inquiry and effort. These constitute the best instruments, organon, the best rudiments by which the way is prepared for the mind's complete knowledge. Therefore, they are called by the name trivium and quadrivium, which we know, because by them, as by certain ways or viae, a quick mind enters into the secret places of wisdom. Elsewhere, our effort should first be given to the arts, and especially to the 7, which comprise the tool of all philosophy, as it is in these 7 liberal arts, the foundation of all learning is to be found. And here he gives us a little insight into what makes them liberal and what makes them art. 7 are called liberal, either because they require minds which are liberal, that is free, that is liberated and practiced, or because in antiquity only free and noble men were accustomed to study them. In all this appears the great diligence of the ancients, who would leave nothing untried, but brought all things under definite rules and precepts, which is what makes them more than practices, makes them into arts when they are defined by certain rules and principles. So That they're central is clear in the tradition. This is the way Hugh defines them in the Didascalicon. Grammar, knowledge of how to speak without error. Dialectic or logic, clear-sighted argument. Rhetoric, persuading to every suitable thing. Arithmetic, discrete multitude. Number, discrete multitude in relation to another discrete multitude. Geometry, immobile magnitude, and mobile magnitude. Or I like number, number in time, number in space, and number in space and time. But you get the idea. I'm sure we all have these kind of definitions in mind. And we see this illustrated throughout the tradition. The 7 liberal arts. Here's Lady Philosophy presenting the 7 liberal arts to Boethius, which are supposed to console him. Of course, the consolation of philosophy. This very well-known piece over here that you probably have seen, which has Lady Philosophy in the middle and 3 streams on one side and 4 streams on the other for the trivium and the quadrivium, with little Plato, or little Socrates and Plato doing their work underneath here. And the poets and the magicians were just not sure what to do with over here, but they're having little black birds whisper into their ears. But even this picture, it's a little confusing because it almost looks like the 7 liberal arts are the sum of philosophy, or that all we have in the tradition is philosophy and the liberal arts. So it strikes me that an overemphasis on the liberal arts can be confusing when we're speaking about classical education and what it entails. So one of the great gifts of the medieval era, certainly medieval thinkers, whether Islamic or Christian, is the emphasis on integration or coherence or harmony or order. You only have to think of Chartres Cathedral and Dante's Comedy to see that impulse, or if you know Aquinas' work. And Hugh is a great example of this, because one thing that Hugh does, I'm sorry, some of this is a little hard to see. Hugh takes the 7 liberal arts, and Hugh also takes all these other divisions of knowledge that he received in the tradition. And we're going to come back to this slide. This is just anticipating a little bit. I want you to see what Hugh does, and then we'll have a run back up to him. So there were the 7 liberal arts. There were what were known as the Servile Arts. Aristotle calls them that. This is a list from John Scotus Erugena. Aristotle had his division of knowledge or science, kind of first philosophy, math, and physics. From a number of the Stoics, you get division of knowledge into physics, logic, and ethics. When Cassiodorus comes on, he was a successor to Boethius. He divides knowledge between divine learning and secular learning. There was also parts of the tradition that Hugh inherited related to the Imago Dei, which was supposed to be rooted in justice and wisdom. And then the Augustinian tradition, which said that man is subjected to ignorance, vice, vulnerability, and confusion. So Hugh inherits all of these, and he's a great example of not only classical education, but also tradition and what happens in traditions, because this is what Hugh does with them. He takes all those which were somewhat disparate, and he organizes them into kind of a complete taxonomy of knowledge and education and the ends of humanity and man's vulnerability. So we'll come back to this, but I want you just to anticipate what Hugh's going to do for us. So we know 7 liberal arts, if you know your brief history of education at all, that they were the new education, that in 5th century BC Athens replaced an older education that was rooted in music and gymnastic. So the soul was trained to feel aright through music, and the body was trained to act aright through military games. And the goal was what was called kalogagathia, the good and beautiful person. What's interesting in the tradition, when you read through the tradition, you realize the 7 liberal arts did not come in fully packaged, which sometimes we act like, that they were developed in time by different people in different places as they took practices and refined them by rules and principles and laws. So one of the fun things it seems like people in the tradition like to do is try to identify who first came up with the various arts and gave them rules. And so these are the 7, and these are just a few examples of some of the people who are identified in the tradition as first developing them. Sometimes they're mythological, sometimes they're historical figures. But what you realize is that these didn't come fully packaged, but again, came at different times in different places and were developed over time. Then you start getting, once you hit the Hellenistic era, you get this kind of education is being referred to as the enkyklaios paideia, which is where we get our word encyclopedia, which just means the circle of knowledge, or when the Romans adopted it, then the liberal arts. And here you have Cicero referring to the fact that he thinks that no man can be an orator unless he is skilled in all the liberal arts. And here you start seeing lists. So you can see Cicero referring to music, astronomy, grammar, oratory, or rhetoric, and geometry. And from there, we start getting lots of documents like this. You just start seeing various lists of the liberal arts. One of the most famous, unfortunately, is a work that has been lost, is Marcus Varro, who gives us 9, including medicine and architecture as liberal arts. Seneca's famous letter 88, you can't really see it there, but he gives us literature, music, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy. Vitruvius, an architect, you can look at his list of the liberal arts. It's 7 plus a number of ones that an architect might need. Galen, doctor, of course, so he throws medicine in there. Sculpture, drawing, law, these are all referred to as liberal arts. So as this tradition starts developing, you see a refinement of the liberal arts until we get, and we don't see these 7 as 7 until we get to this very strange character, Marcianus Capella, and his book, The Wedding of Philology and Mercury, which C.S. Lewis said was one of the most strange creations the world has ever seen. It's a tedious book, but it's somewhat fascinating, and Capella then becomes definitive for the tradition, and he gives us the 7. Augustine, in his retractions, sounds like such an academic here, where he says, I also attempted to write books on the liberal arts, but I was only able to complete the book on grammar, which I lost. And 6 books on music pertaining to that part, which is called rhythm. Of the other 5 arts, likewise, begun there, dialectic, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, and philosophy. The beginnings alone remained, and I lost even these, except I think I loaned them out to somebody, and somebody has them somewhere. So, unfortunately, we don't have Augustine's writings on the 7 liberal arts, but it's clear that's what he was endeavoring to do. Cassiodorus, successor of Boethius, again, we get the 7 liberal arts in his work, The Institutes. Isidore Seville, again, we get the 7 listed. Until we come to just, that's the consistent record that we see through Cassiodorus, Isidore, Alcuin, Rabanus, Maurus, the 7 liberal arts. Now, there were also multiple divisions of knowledge that Hugh inherited, and these are just up here as examples to show that what Hugh did was not an invention just of Hugh, but it was Hugh developing the tradition that he inherited. And I think for me, this is instructive for us as we're trying to recover classical education and find our own place in this tradition, as we're not trying to replicate any one time in history. Because I don't know why we would choose one particular time in history over the other, because this is a tradition that does develop over time. But you can see here, these kind of things were in the air. Aristotle's division, Boethius's division, which he took from Aristotle. The Stoic tradition of philosophy is physics, ethics, and logic. Again, Cassiodorus. A few more. Alcuin of York. Gilbert of Poiré doesn't even try to incorporate the liberal arts. William of Conches does, but in a somewhat idiosyncratic way. So let's come back to this and spend just a little bit of time looking at what Hugh gives us in the Didascalicon. So he takes this and organizes it like this. Just take a look at that and see what you see. I'll point out a couple things that we could probably spend the afternoon looking at this and what Hugh tries to do. You see that Hugh has taken the liberal arts and embedded them in this larger taxonomy of knowledge. They're not the central, they're not the core piece. They are kind of planks in larger disciplines. One of the things that's quite interesting, he has 4 divisions of arts: the theoretical arts, which pursue the true, the practical arts, which pursue, if you will, the good, and are taken up with both personal, economic, and political ethics. This is a unique innovation of Hugh. He puts the mechanical arts on the same level with the theoretical arts and the practical arts. First person to do that, and the logical arts. Here's Hugh's explanation, and we'll come back to that in a second. He says, consider these three: wisdom, virtue, and need. Wisdom is the understanding of things as they are. Virtue is a habit of the mind, adapted harmoniously to reason like in nature. A need is something without which we cannot live, but with which we would live more happily. The following are remedies against three evils to which human life is subject: wisdom against ignorance, virtue against vice, and need against life's weakness. In order to do away with the three evils, we seek after the three remedies, and in order to find the three remedies, every art and every discipline was discovered. He's rooting the arts and education and learning and knowledge in the human condition and trying to show that these meet our frailties or our lacks somehow. For the sake of wisdom, the theoretical arts were discovered. For the sake of virtue, the practical arts were discovered. For the sake of our needs, the mechanical arts were discovered. These three were first in practice, but afterwards, for the sake of eloquence, logic was discovered. Four, then, are the principal sciences, and he uses science and art and discipline interchangeably and kind of says, I'm not really taken with those people who are too careful with the terminology. Same with philosophy. He uses it in multiple different ways. And he says, four, then, are the principal sciences from which all the others descend. These are the theoretical, the practical, the mechanical, and the logical. He also says here that of all human acts or pursuits, the end and intention ought to regard one of two things: either the restoring of our nature's integrity or the relieving of those weaknesses to which our present life lies subject. This is our entire task: the restoration of our nature and the removal of our deficiency. The integrity of human nature, however, is attained in two things: in knowledge and in virtue, and in these lie our soul likeness to the angelic and divine substances. Because for Hugh, the imago Dei that was lost was taken up with knowledge and virtue, and so he says part of education is restoring us to our human flourishing in which we were created. So back to that. Those are, in a way, negative impulses for education and the development of the arts for Hugh, that we have these needs that we suffer from, which he says are three. We need food, we need to prepare for future harms, and we need a remedy for present harms. And he splits the mechanical arts into his own trivium and quadrivium. He says there are three related to external cover and four related to internal nourishment. And these are really, really fun, some of these, because, for instance, when he gets to hunting, he has a whole list of all the different kinds. It includes baking, brewing, and he has a whole list of all the kinds of alcohol that it includes, and Galatian tarts, and he has all these kinds of exotic foods you would not expect from a 12th century monastic. And another interesting thing that he gives us with respect to the mechanical arts is theatrics, which he says provides joy for our souls. This recognition that our souls need entertainment. And with medicine as well, he refers to not only physical ailments of the body, but psychological reactions of the soul. Again, somewhat unexpected for a 12th century monastic, I think. There are also two positive things that compel education and learning for Hugh. Our basic nature. He says our nature exercises itself in the grasp of things present, or the understanding of things absent, or the investigation of things unknown. This power belongs to humankind alone. It belongs to this nature that by things already known to it, it seeks after things not known, and etc. Another positive impulse for education for Hugh is this great line in De Sacramentis, the first kind of medieval systematic theology, where he says, God would not be praised in all his works by the rational creature if all the works of God were not known by the rational creature. This is a fantastic medieval theological justification for pursuing sciences and all kinds of knowledge, it seems. So Hugh gives us this integrated taxonomy of knowledge and education, and he roots it, I think, also instructive for us in human nature, that education ought to serve human flourishing. And these four divisions, you can't really see it here, but the logical arts overcome confusion, mechanical overcome vulnerability, practical overcome vice, and theoretical overcome ignorance. All of which together, he says, constitute the pursuit of wisdom or knowledge. Now, a couple questions that we might have for Hugh, certainly given this symposium, is what he does with history. He's not really sure what to do with history, to be honest. You see grammar here in this long line over here to what I call, or what he calls, the appendages of the arts. He says, these are things like songs of the poets, tragedies, comedies, fables, and histories. I have two quibbles with him. I wish that he had an element here of the fine arts, because he's got the good and the true. I just wish he had the beautiful as well, which maybe come here under theatrics, and what he does with the poets and historians. So I have a couple suggestions for where history might fit in Hugh. These are the three places he talks about histories. One, again, the appendages. He has that whole list, and he says these are tangential to philosophy. They give us meager fruit, entertaining reading, but, he says, sometimes we take up a thought we come upon in the midst of a story more eagerly. So it's like he's not sure what to do with it there, but another place they seem to be integral to grammar. But this is interesting to me when he goes to talk about Scripture. He's got histories there, and so he has to grapple with that. And he really sets out what looks to me like a pretty fine description of the historian's task. He says, first, you learn history and diligently commit to memory, reviewing from beginning to end what has been done, when it has been done, where it has been done, and by whom it has been done. These are the four things which are especially to be sought for in history: the person, the business done, the time, and the place. Learn everything. You will see afterwards that nothing is superfluous. A skimpy knowledge is not a pleasant thing. So he seems to have this concept of what history can do for us. I'm going to suggest there are a couple other places Hugh might have taken history. One, coming back to this quote, that he says, our nature exercises itself in the grasp of things present, understanding of things absent, or the investigation of things unknown. That's kind of his description of the theoretical arts. So it seems to me, to come back to this, that it's possible Hugh could have placed thought of history as a theoretical art, grasping the nature of truth of what has come before us. Could be that he could have included history under theatrics, which is give us joy that renews the mind, just the delight we take in reading stories of what has been. Possibly as well under ethics, which a number of our historians in the tradition wrote to give us examples of virtuous, courageous individuals. The kind of lives of great men or hagiographical idea. So I thought Hugh had possibilities for where he could have put history there. I have inserted them in multiple places where my man Hugh could have put them. But just a couple conclusions, a couple of final thoughts, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Roper. I think Hugh does a couple things for us. He shows us a model of integration of knowledge and the arts and sciences, a model of integration and coherence and order, which those of us who are in classical education care about. He roots education in the telos of the human person, and knows that to reduce the scope of education is to reduce the scope of human being, and that education ought to somehow contribute to our human flourishing. And I think he's a great model for, again, tradition, and how we receive, like any era, we receive something from the tradition ahead of us. We reject some of it, we sort through it, we use some of it, and we pass on some of it, which to the next era, which goes on to develop it, just like Hugh did, and I think just what we're trying to do right now. So I think Hugh gives us models for how the liberal arts can be integrated and how we receive and pass on tradition. There you go, just a window into Hugh. Thanks.